Do you want to use a jetpack alongside a flamethrower? If you said yes, please continue watching. If the answer is no,
you are sad and I have no desire to speak with you further.
How yin's doing? I'm Ian, and this is my TF2 How to Killstreak series, where we look at the best and worst TF2 has to offer and I show you how to get a killstreak with it, because everything is a bad idea until it works. Let's not waste any more time, we have a jetpack in our arsenal today because we're covering the thermal thruster. Let's get into it. The thermal thruster is acquired from the contracts that were introduced alongside it in Jungle Inferno, meaning even a freshly installed noob can acquire this thing with little issue. As for what the thermal thruster itself does, it's a jetpack that takes up your secondary slot, meaning you're going to have to forego the shotguns and flare guns in order to utilize this thing. But don't get your hopes too high, there's a limit to how much vertical mobility this thing will grant. You don't get full 360 mobility like you would with a helicopter in Flight Simulator. No, rather you get 2 charges that give you super jumps effectively. These super jumps are more or less the equivalent of a soldier's rocket jump with none of the pesky downsides such as self-harm from activation. Instead, this weapon is counterbalanced by effectively being incapable of doing damage at long range, meaning if opponents are outside of flamethrower range, you cannot hurt them directly unless you reflect the rocket at them. However, don't think for a second that you're incapable of getting kills with your secondary. There are actually 2 ways of going about this. First is you can fart at people with your taunt kill. The infinitely more practical method of going about this, however, is what's known as the Goomba Stomp. You see, this thing has the nice little bonus of effectively turning enemy opposition into landing pads. You see, if you land on another opponent while using this thing after jumping into the air, all fall damage that you would normally receive will be transferred to whoever you landed on instead. This can prove to be quite invaluable on maps with a great degree of verticality such as Hightower. However, the true power of the thermal thruster is not its ability to get kills directly as you crush people under your foot. No, the true power of this weapon, much like the previously covered Sticky Jumper and Bonk Atomic Punch, is to actually use it as a tool to get you in position to kill with your other weapons. As I just stated, this works best on maps with a great degree of verticality, such as Hightower. However, on more flat and open maps, you will have to be a bit more cautious, since flying through the air at high speed makes you a very easy target for snipers, sentries, and other forms of hit scan to annihilate you. And please remember, when you're using this thing, you can't use the pyro's other secondaries, so if your plan for dealing with snipers is to set them on fire with your flare gun, you're not going to be able to pull that off anymore when you're using this as your secondary. Now, your preferred method of dealing with snipers is to take flank routes through tunnels and the like where they can't snipe you, and then jetpack up to their perch so you can annihilate them with your weapon of choice. However, when you decide to do this, I strongly recommend saving a charge left in your jetpack so you have an escape route. After all, we're trying to go for a killstreak here, not suicide bomb the enemy team. On the subject of the enemy team, please bear in mind that the other players you're against are human beings. No, I am not talking about being respectful to your other players, I am talking about how they're going to learn what you're doing and adapt accordingly. So if you use the same flank route 5 times in a row, don't be surprised when someone gets wise and kills you en route. Yes, I am aware of how clueless players can be in casual. However, much like random crits, they will only benefit your opponents, never you. So always assume that the enemy team will be able to adapt and counterbalance whatever you have planned until evidence to the contrary appears. With that covered, let's go into the specific playstyles and loadouts you may want to consider when using the thermal thruster. When it comes to weapons to use alongside the thermal thruster, I personally recommend the backburner as well as the back scratcher. When it comes to primaries, I recommend the backburner for one very obvious reason: guaranteed crits. You see, the backburner gives you guaranteed critical hits so long as the enemy is facing away from you, at the expense of making your air blast cost more. And when you're using the thermal thruster, you'll find that getting behind the enemy team is going to be trivially easy. However, if you find yourself in need of air blasting as much as possible, you may want to consider using the stock instead, since it has the lowest air blast cost of any of the pyro's primaries. There's even a direct upgraded version of this weapon called the Rain Blower, which is exactly the same to the stock flamethrower, except that it can taunt kill. Because of how irrelevant taunt kills are to any kind of serious play, I would say the Rain Blower is probably the only direct upgrade in the entire game that has exactly 0 chance of ever being nerfed. Moving on to your other primaries, the Dragon's Fury is actually quite good, and that's unsurprising since these two weapons were actually released together in Jungle Inferno. The Dragon's Fury is unquestionably the best pyro primary to use against other pyros. This is because it's the only primary that doesn't actually rely on afterburn damage to kill anyone. Instead, it relies on its incredible burst damage against lone targets. Whilst the Dragon's Fury can be used against large groups of enemies, it's simply outclassed by the other flamethrowers in this regard. As for the Phlogistinator, I personally recommend against it. This is because you have no secondary to do long-range damage with, meaning building up the oomph meter will be a lot harder than it otherwise would be. And since the Flog can't use air blast whatsoever, you're gonna find yourself getting killed by projectiles such as Soldier's Rockets and Demo Man Pills a lot more than you used to when compared to playing with the other primaries as Pyro. Moving on to Pyro's last primary we have yet to cover, the Degreaser. It's okay. It can easily offset the downsides of the Thermal Thruster's rather slow deploy and holster animations, though proper timing can offset this as well. And while the Degreaser does do less afterburn damage, this really isn't much of an issue, especially if you're using the Extinguisher. Speaking of which, let's move on to your melee weapons. I've already done an entire video on Pyro's melee weapons as a whole, and I'll leave a link in the description if you want my comprehensive thoughts on them in their entirety, but to briefly go over how they work alongside the Thermal Thruster for your convenience, the Extinguisher is viable, especially if used alongside the Degreaser, but due to the very slow animations of deploying and holstering the Thermal Thruster, I honestly don't think there's a particularly strong synergy here. If you think it sounds like fun, by all means go ahead. However, if you're serious about getting as many kills as possible, there are better options. Speaking of weapons that have better options, the Hot Hand, Anything Stock, the Neon Annihilator, 3rd Degree, the Sharpened Volcano Fragment, and the Homewrecker are all just absolutely horrible for going for killstreaks alongside the Thermal Thruster. Some of these things, like the Homewrecker, are just absolutely god-awful at getting kills in the first place and have no place in the purposes of getting you a killstreak, whilst the weapons like the Neon Annihilator encourage you to stay put in one area and camp a single pond of water somewhere, which is kinda counterintuitive to how the whole Jetpack thing works. The Power Jack is never truly a wrong answer, with its increased movement speed while deployed. However, when you have a Jetpack as your secondary, the increased movement speed is a little redundant and not completely necessary. Hence why I recommend the Back Scratcher. With the Back Scratcher, you'll gain extra health from health kits whenever you pick them up, regardless if the Back Scratcher is deployed or not. This means with some basic map knowledge, you should be able to pick up health packs rather quickly and easily, especially with the mobility the Thermal Thrusters give you, to the point where even scouts will struggle to keep up with you in your health pack stealing traditions. After all, the downside of the Back Scratcher is that you heal less from medi guns, dispensers, and the payload cart. All three of these things are not going to be healing you very much if at all, considering the fact that you're going to be flanking the enemy with your Jetpack. Combine this with the fact that Back Scratcher has 25% more melee damage compared to the other melee options the Pyro has, and it's not hard to see why I view this as the objective best weapon to use alongside the Thermal Thruster. All in all, I give the Thermal Thruster a discount Trollger out of 10. You gain insane vertical mobility at the cost of damage output. However, unlike Trollger, you still get to keep your primary weapon, meaning you're still going to be competitively viable in a serious pub setting. Whilst this weapon is somewhat map dependent, I honestly would not recommend it on Dust Bowl whatsoever. The Thermal Thruster is amazing for whenever you see a crazy flank route you can take as Soldier, and just think to yourself, man, I wish I could take that route as Pyro. That's all for now. Like the video if you did, subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. Comment what weapons Ians want to see me cover next. I've been an Ian, and this has been my TF2 How to Killstreak guide to the Thermal Thruster. And stay tuned, Caper is coming up next.